So welcome to my literature search presentation on for clinical informatics and digital health, my top 5 of 2015 and 2016. My name's Leonie Abbott. I have completed a Bachelor of Pharmacy and Graduate Certificate in Pharmacy Practice. I've also completed a Master of Public Health. I'm currently the Emergency Pharmacist at Barwon Health. In terms of project management experience, I was involved with the Efficiency 3 Redesign Pharmacy project, and also in terms of informatics, I was the project coordinator for Barwon Health for rolling out the National Prescribe and Dispense Repository associated with the Personally Controlled Electronic Healthcare Record. So the focus of my literature search is clinical decision support for drug-drug interactions. Medication errors are a significant burden to our healthcare system. That's on admission, during admission, on transfer, and also after discharge. Locally, we have a very strong focus on initiatives to reduce medication errors and harm. Our next strategic priority is the implementation of an electronic healthcare record with decision support. So drug-drug interactions are considered to be a preventable cause of harm in hospital. There's various statistics quoted, but up to 4% of admissions are caused by preventable drug-drug interactions. Most of the articles I've found in this area highlight problems, particularly alert fatigue and interruption of clinical workflow, which may have deleterious consequences. So I've chosen this area because of how important it is, also the fact that we can have an impact in preventing the harm associated with the drug-drug interactions. I feel like we need to be guided by research as well as best practice, and it's seemingly a very complex area. So in terms of my search strategy, I looked at 3 areas that were of interest to me. I haven't had a lot of informatics experience, so as I went through the course, I obviously learnt key concepts, which then allowed me to build on the 3 areas of interest. So I looked at quite broadly pharmacy, electronic healthcare records, and then informatics in emergency. So I initially had a very broad look at the literature using some of the keywords in the table, and then I focused in on drug-drug interactions. So I used keywords such as electronic medical record, electronic healthcare record, EHR, drug-drug interactions, informatics, information science, decision support, medication error, medication safety, pharmacy, pharmacist, adverse drug reaction, computerized physician order entry, alert fatigue, prescribing, and hospital. To do this, I used PubMed, CINAHL, and Embase, and I then also did a search of the Cochrane database and Joanna Briggs Institute. I also used Google Scholar using the same keywords to identify any other articles. And I performed a manual search of informatics and pharmacy journals from the Barwon Health Library. So I screened quite loosely up to 75 articles and then drilled it down to drug-drug interaction articles, which were 10 articles that I looked at to then pick out the 5 I've used to present today. So the articles that I've chosen each address a different aspect of the complexity associated with clinical decision support and drug-drug interactions. So specifically, Article 1 addresses the fact that we need clinical decision support from clinicians' perspectives. 2, that decision-making occurs in clinical context. 3, addresses an alert reduction strategy. 4 is around best practice and the importance of consistency. And 5 talks about the sources of drug-drug information and the inconsistency associated with some of the evidence. So from my perspective as a pharmacist, systems that I've had experience with often have high rates of drug-drug interaction alerts. Throughout the literature, alert fatigue indicates that there is a potential to compromise the efficacy of this clinical decision support. So again, this could even make error rates worse if there's workarounds or automatic responses. So from my experience, I was interested in clinical decision support quite broadly and generally, and the evidence, but also difference in minor interactions, which generally don't impact clinical decisions, but also the significant interactions, which really need to be considered and generally impact clinical workflow. Also, practically, from my experience with end users, they often have quite polarised opinions. So they either blindly believe that clinical decision support will solve all of our problems, or they're quite disillusioned with it. So journal article 1 was termed Identifying Effective Computerised Strategies to Prevent Drug-Drug Interactions in Hospital, a User-Centred Approach. It involves semi-structured interviews to determine opinions of experts and prescribers on computerised strategies for identification and prevention of drug-drug interactions in hospital. It involved Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 1 involved talking to the drug experts, so 3 pharmacologists and 5 pharmacists, and Phase 2 was talking to 18 prescribers. So concerns were raised regarding alert fatigue. There was preference for an alert rather than a user-initiated interaction checker. And it was recognised by prescribers that their ability to recognise drug-drug interactions when time-constrained was limited. They agreed that they needed a tool to identify drug-drug interactions, and certainly junior medical officers were not confident in their ability to recognise drug-drug interactions. There was an idea that overriding an alert could require an approval process, so whether that could be sent through to a pharmacist for further identification or investigation. And interestingly, the extent of drug-drug interaction thought when prescribing varied quite a lot. So less than half stated that they always considered it when prescribing. So from this article, we can see that there is a lack of confidence in identification of drug-drug interactions, which indicates a strategy cannot safely rely on individuals to seek out the information themselves and does require something that alerts or is visible at the time of prescribing. So the second article for consideration is titled Clinical Reasoning in the Context of Active Decision Support During Medication Prescribing. So prescribing decisions in clinical context of workflow were examined and reasoning was looked at during consideration of drug-drug interaction alerts. Doctors responded to alerts and verbalised their thoughts while completing a standard protocol. There were 5 systems involved across 2 countries, the USA and the Netherlands, and it involved 32 participants. Observations were considered within the socio-technical framework and were matched for severity. Reasoning was similar across the sites despite very different systems. High severity alerts resulted in clinical decisions to reduce risk in 40% and only 9% were left unchanged. This is in contrast to low severity alerts which rarely impacted therapy decisions. They were left unaltered in 71% of cases. And when risk could not be avoided, decisions were often made after evaluating clinical context. So in conclusion, user-centred design could improve development of clinical decision support. So display of clinical information may improve the efficiency of these alerts. And systems for low and high severity alerts should be different, with workflow interruption only in high-risk drug-drug interactions. So the third article for consideration was Think Time, a novel approach to analysis of clinicians' behaviour after reduction of drug-drug interaction alerts. So this study was used to investigate the impact on think time using an alert reduction strategy. They defined think time as the interval between alert appearance and when all actions were completed to resolve. They altered the drug-drug interaction database by changing severity for 18 drug pairs. And these were often pairs of drugs that were prescribed together. They were responsible for 9.1% of alerts and overridden in 96% of the time. They were Primarily pharmacodynamic interactions, they were pairs that might have had a synergistic or antagonistic action. So, for example, opioids prescribed with naloxone or anticoagulants with antithrombotic agents. So they found a reduction in alerts of 10.3%. This was compared to a reduction of total orders only by 0.78%. So they found that think time when a user selected to go back and reconsider increased by over 1 second. However, think time when the user proceeded decreased by half a second. So this study was a 6-month period, and when they extrapolated the reduction in time spent viewing these alerts across to 12 months, it saved 13.6 hours per year. They also found that there were differences in physicians' specialty in terms of their think time, so potentially that certain physicians were very familiar with particular drug interactions. And overall, they achieved a 10% reduction in alert rates, although it didn't demonstrate a reduction in override rate. So they concluded that locally generated alert processes can lead to improved electronic health record alerts and can increase efficiency. They also stated that override rate remained high and really needs further research to improve efficiency. So the next article for consideration is recommendations to improve the usability of drug-drug interaction clinical decision support alerts. So the aim of this study was to establish a preferred strategy for presenting drug-drug interaction clinical decision support alerts. It involved a work group of 24, which included clinical usability and informatics experts that represented academia, vendors, and healthcare organisations. They discussed a number of issues once a month and also met twice over a 12-month period. And the focus was to address a number of questions, and that was what, how, where, and when do we display drug-drug interaction decision support? Should presentation of drug-drug interaction decision support vary by clinicians? And how should effectiveness of drug-drug interaction decision support be measured? So there were quite a number of recommendations made throughout this article, and these included from a human factors engineering perspective, that research indicates visibility, colour and prioritisation will influence responses to safety warnings. However, there's not a lot of information specific to the drug-drug interaction alert space, and really we should have evidence to guide how we present these alerts. They acknowledge that inconsistent alert presentation does occur from different systems to clinicians, and really felt that that's an area that we should get more information about and improve on. They recommended that there should be 7 components to an alert. So it should indicate the drugs that are involved, the seriousness, the potential clinical consequences, the mechanism of interaction. It should also inform any contextual information or modifying factors. It should include recommended actions and also the evidence for the interaction. They also suggested that we should be using consistent terms and definitions to indicate the seriousness of the drug-drug interaction. An alert should describe the mechanism of drug-drug interaction, because it may also facilitate and assist the clinician to identify other alternatives. And very importantly, that the right information needs to be presented to the right clinician at the right time. So that's in line with the context and also the workflow. They also recommended that interruptive alerts need to be reserved for the most serious drug-drug interactions. So their concluding statement was around improved effectiveness will improve alert value and then may also reduce alert fatigue. They also suggested a central repository for alert data could optimise the value of individual alerts. So the last article for discussion is titled Comparison of Two Databases to Detect Potential Drug-Drug Interactions Between Prescriptions of HIV/AIDS Patients in Clinical Care. So this was a retrospective cross-sectional study of two databases to detect drug-drug interactions in a high-risk patient group. So it was HIV ventilated patients in ICU who are very high risk for drug-drug interactions. So the two databases that they looked at was Micromedics, which requires payment for subscription, and it classifies drug-drug interactions into 4 categories, so contraindicated, major, moderate and minor. They compared it to drugs.com, which classifies severity into major, moderate and minor, and is free. So it involved 40 patients out of 75 eligible who were admitted for longer than 48 hours. They analysed 106 prescriptions for drug-drug interactions. Micromedics identified 347 interactions as opposed to drugs which identified 615 drug-drug interactions. So agreement regarding the severity of the interaction was 68.3%. Agreement around the mechanism of action for a drug-drug interaction for the two databases was better at 82.4%. And a total of 307 interactions were described by both of the databases. So Micromedics classified 37.6% of drug-drug interactions as contraindicated or major, as opposed to drugs.com, which identified only 11.3%. So there were 22 major drug-drug interactions detected by Micromedics, and they were considered to be, by drugs.com, moderate or minor, as opposed to 6 major interactions identified by drugs.com, which were considered as minor or moderate by Micromedics. So they concluded that overall agreement between databases was moderate. And as part of, in context with some of the other articles which recommend different processes for high severity and low severity, it's very difficult when the evidence isn't consistent between systems. So in terms of the future state, post doing the literature search and looking at those 5 particular articles, I still believe that decision support for drug-drug interactions is quite a complex area. All of the articles suggest that we need a greater evidence base to draw from. It also, a lot of those articles evaluate the decision support just in the context of the drug-drug interactions. And I think that it also needs to be evaluated in the context of the entire system. So that also includes a variety of other alerts that can be interruptive to doctors' workflow. So from the articles that I have selected, it leads myself to asking the following questions and to looking at further research. So clinicians seem to believe that drug-drug interactions are drug-drug interaction alerts are necessary rather than seeking information for themselves. However, how that's done without alert fatigue really needs further elucidation and evidence. The user-centered design to incorporate context within an alert also would require further research to determine if it impacts efficiency. So that is pulling other information out of the electronic healthcare record and presenting it at the time of decision making. Many systems have a very high override rate, and systems that treat low and high severity drug-drug interactions differently could potentially improve efficiency, but again, we need further information about the outcomes. Consistency of alert may improve the effectiveness and value of the alert, so reducing alert fatigue. Again, further research in that area is needed. It also needs to be able to bring vendors and government into those discussions, and so that we get the consistency that we may need. Information sources and evidence for drug-drug interactions do often classify the interaction differently, so that again adds another complexity to this area. So strategies to facilitate this consistency could improve outcomes. Most articles mention their concern with alert fatigue, and there's various statistics that are quoted, but up to 98% of alerts that don't impact clinical decisions. And realistically, in the context of what I've mentioned above, that there needs to be some further research assessing the high override rate and the alert fatigue that really every article refers to. And this may require further understanding of workflow and how decisions are made clinically. And realistically, the risk of an automatic response to these alerts, is that the error rates are actually made worse by clinical decision support. So future research, areas of research could include understanding clinician behaviour and their decision making, the consistent approach and the impact on outcomes or impact on decisions, impact of clinical context, the further information around reduction in alerts. Does that actually make an impact? We also need collaboration with vendors to facilitate this consistent approach. And is local level flexibility needed, and is it safe? And also there needs to be some investigation around the legal consequences of not displaying some of these alerts. So really, I suppose my conclusion is that we need more evidence. We need to learn from systems which are already implemented, particularly in the Australian environment. And we need to measure these outcomes and find out whether we are improving preventable drug-drug interactions using clinical decision support. Thank you.